I'd like to now welcome Dr. Elisabeth Wiig and look forward to her presentation.
Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm just showing you right now the financial disclosure. I think you all know that I am the author of CELF-5 and that I receive royalties. Another issue is that CELF-5 is obviously a comprehensive assessment process. It is one in which clinicians collect evidence about communication abilities in multiple contexts and from multiple perspectives. And what we're trying to do today is to answer some tough questions that have been posed to us by clinicians. And you are also encouraged to submit questions about specific cases or about test scores before or after the session, and we will make sure to respond to you in one way or the other. Basically, our objectives are to describe when individual self-tests should and should not be used to identify a language disorder, describe the role of memory in language performance on the CELF-5 test, explain how score discrepancy comparisons will influence your interpretation, and also explain test results and make recommendations when a student's performance on CELF-5 does not meet a program's eligibility requirement. And in the next slide, you will see, just for the fun, a picture of all the students that can be reached and all the age levels that can be reached by CELF-5, describing contexts and situations. The next slide is coming up. One of the questions that has come up a couple of times is whether or not you can qualify a student for services based on the results of only one of the tests on CELF-5. Well, the answer is I, as a clinician, wouldn't do it. And I'll tell you, and maybe you shouldn't either. The important thing is to obtain a broad picture of a student's language and communication strengths and weaknesses. That cannot be done with one test. Another thing is specifying the language areas that have been tested and also where you find the strengths and weaknesses. And thirdly, to ensure that there is adequate content coverage. One test will not do that. Another issue is that if you begin to evaluate the psychometric characteristics of a single test and could begin to compare it to the characteristics of CELF-5 and the core language scores and index scores based on the sampling characteristics, bias, issues, reliability, validity, and clinical utility, then you will find that the answer is one test does not equal assessment. Now, we will now look at CELF-5 from multiple assessment perspectives: RTI, a clinical perspective, an educational perspective, and a social perspective. From the RTI perspective, an important aspect of a test is whether or not the language disorder will affect classroom performances. And for that, on the CELF-5, we evaluate language and communication in context with the observational rating scales, other authentic descriptive measures such as language sampling and so on, and other information about current classroom accommodations, potential accommodations, adaptations, and enhancements. If a student does not respond to a variety of classroom intervention, then the question becomes, is that inability to respond due to a language skills deficit? And for that, obviously, we need to administer tests that are appropriate to the student's age to answer very specifically the referral questions that were given by the teachers and the school in general. If we identify a language disorders, what do we need to plan for intervention? We need to identify the nature of the disorder by answering specific questions, and specifically we might ask, are there significant differences in language comprehension versus expression? Are there significant differences in terms of content versus structure? Is memory involved? And how will that affect classroom performance, language, and communication? From a clinical perspective, we have specific questions that relate to various specific aspects of CELF-5. To answer if there's evidence of a language disorder, we can look at the core language scores. These are the most reliable and indeed with the highest clinical utility, and we will come back to that later. We need to answer what is the nature of the disorder, and we need to compare index scores, receptive versus expressive, content versus structure, language memory in terms of identifying strengths and weaknesses. Now we get to the issue of how does the student's performance compare with that of his classroom peers? And obviously, to do that, we will look at norm reference performances compared to the student's age and grade level. That allows us to answer, is there a chance that the student isn't able to have equity of access to the curriculum materials that relate to language and communication? A fourth question is, does the student's clinical performance profile meet criteria for eligibility for speech and language services? Those are indeed what the clinician is there or has to be concerned about. In terms of an educational perspective, we should be able to go to the classroom teacher and say which aspects of communication in context are compromised for this student. And for that, the ORS, the pragmatics profile, pragmatics activities checklists, and other observations will serve to answer that question. Which aspects of academic performance are compromised? There we get into the areas of listening, speaking, reading, writing, other areas such as verbal math. And CELF-5 also provides you with a glimpse into the student's reading comprehension and also written language ability through the structured writing test. Thirdly comes which curriculum objectives are compromised. And basically, those can be compared to the core standards if your system uses the core standards. But there are always objectives for English, language arts, social studies, sciences, arithmetic, algebra, physical education, art, so on. And we are very much concerned with all the curriculum areas that where performance depends on interpretation and processing and also expressing oneself orally or in writing. And what are the students' strengths, weaknesses, and what learning adjustments are in place? For that, we turn to the observational rating scale. From a social perspective, we have put the pragmatics profile, the pragmatics checklist, and the pragmatics activities. Those are the ones that really will answer that. If we ask what aspects of social communication are compromised, the pragmatics test and rating scale will tell us about perspective taking in interpersonal communication, nonverbal communication abilities, and so on. What aspects of peer relations are compromised? That is where you have to interpret. Are they the interactions compromised for play or game activities in the classroom, establishing friendships, interactive sharing, participating in conversations or discussions in the classroom or outside of the classroom? And the third one is, what aspects of student-adult relationships are compromised? And those we often do not think about. For example, does the student show the respect for the adults that is expected in order to perform within the classroom ambiance and set of rules? Can the student follow directions for activities? How is the student's self-management of behavior? Is there mutual respect between the student and adults? And does the student trust the adults in the relationship? And obviously, these are important because these are basically lifelong. These will influence adolescence dating, marriage, adult dating, marriage, and so on, all relationships in the social domain. Now let us address some of the specific questions and answers from test. Here is one question that says, a student has trouble keeping up with his work in language arts, but his CELF-5 scores are in the low to mid-80s. Why does he not qualify for services? Well, from a clinical perspective, educational perspective, we should say that this student's performances are in the at-risk range. That range is between -1 and -1.5 standard deviations of the mean. Well, this is a student where basically consultation with the classroom teacher would seem to be immediately indicated. Without knowing the student's age, of course, we cannot establish the 90% confidence interval for each of the CELF-5 composites to estimate what his scores might have been in the worst and the best case scenario if the test were repeated. Because we all know that when you repeat a test on the same student, you're not going to get the same standard score. And what you're looking for is the 90% confidence interval to say, is indeed, if you re-administer the test, might it be below the 80s? And if there is a bias towards performance within the range that is below 80, you have a good reason to say, let's try an RTI approach before we consider a possible direct intervention. Another thing is that we constantly refer to the normal curve to gain further insights into how a student performs in general in relation to age peers. And that is just basically, in CELF-5, we said that we are going to describe the performance ranges in terms of an educational perspective. But we are also looking in terms of severity ranges, which is what the clinical situation, the physician will want. So we have these levels. Take a look at the red marginal educational range, at risk, mild severity range. Those are the standard scores between 79 to 85. They are within the -1 to 1.5 standard deviation of the mean. And now you can see why we are interested in the 90% performance or confidence interval with that student that we were asked the question about. The low educational range, moderate severity, 71 to 78, within 1.5 to 2, -2.2 standard deviations of the mean. And then we get to the very low educational range, severe severity range, standard scores of 70 and below. And nobody argues about these kids because they had better get help, or society will have to take care of them maybe for the rest of their life. Here is the same information represented against the normal curve with percentiles and composite scales. And you basically see in the middle the low average classroom performance within the oval that says that encompasses 34.13% of our children in schools. At risk is 13.59%. And within the disorder categories, we can identify 0.13 plus 2.14 plus part of the percentage, so we get up to the 4 or 5% range. Now, in terms of CELF-5, it obviously uses the normal curve as a reference point for the development of subtest scale scores as well as composite and index scale scores. Students who are scoring between 70 and 100 are really not performing just fine in the classroom. Let us take a look at it. If you had and let's begin with the highest one that's at the bottom. If you have a score of 95, 73% of the students perform better than you. 75% perform better than you. 87, 81%. You're at 85 for a standard score, and 84% perform better than you. So now when you get down to the 80s, it's 91%, at 78, 93%. Now, I would say that if 84 to 85% of my classroom performed better than me, I might need some help, either in classroom intervention or adjustments, so on, or tutoring or other forms of services, because I am still at the low end of the scale. Then I'm pushing on the wrong thing. I am sorry. Here we go. With CELF-5, we basically are testing the language fundamentals. Does the student know the basic morphological rules, syntactic rules? Does the student have the word content that is required? And are the interactions between memory and the structure and content of language, are those interactions good enough to keep the student moving along in the academic universe, which gets harder and harder all the time? Now, we do need to take a look with some of our students who have gotten to the age level of 9, 10, 11, where they should have moved to the next level of language skills, namely the metalinguistic skills. They should have crossed the bridge from basically concretely functioning language skill to abstract, metaphoric, basically the implicit messages that are given, making inferences, predictions, and so on. The metalinguistic awareness that is required and developed after 9 to 11 and should be in place at 13, 14, goes beyond understanding and using linguistic rules. Students with language disorders who have received language intervention may have acquired adequate linguistic knowledge. You might have had this student in the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. At the end of the 5th grade, the student goes to the 6th grade, and you say, well, the linguistic knowledge on CELF-5 is still 83. It's not really good. So you now begin to say, hey, how does this student perform in the area of metalinguistic awareness? And basically, this awareness and also the metacognitive abilities are separate from their linguistic skills. It's standing back and looking at on language and what language can do, and how language interrelates to your thinking, how you can express things politely and implicitly rather than harshly and concretely, just to mention a few. CELF-5 has a continuation test, the CELF-5 metalinguistics, and that test is designed to look at the understanding of and use of higher level language skills, the abstract, the metaphoric, and so on. And what this test can answer is, how does the student perform in academic and social situations when it comes to the higher level metalinguistic abilities? And for that, CELF-5 metalinguistics provides a metalinguistics profile for rating. Another issue is a disorder in the higher level language skills that really has not been worked on while we worked on the semantics, the morphology, and the syntax, and some of the early pragmatic skills. So we need to say, what is the nature of the disorder? And to find that out, we compared two indices, the metapragmatics, which is related basically to communication context, and the metasemantics index, related to how you think with words and language, and what you can understand without it being said. And again, we can answer the question, are there deficits in special skill areas? And indeed, we can now begin to look at how does this process, the metalinguistics CELF-5 assessment process, complement. For example, the assessment process would complement a look at the social interaction, a look at basically all the skills that are needed for higher level thinking. We do know there is a relationship between metalinguistic skills and academic performance. Reading comprehension and metalinguistic skills are strongly linked. Teaching multiple meaning words, for example, homonyms and ambiguity detection skills to third graders has proved to improve reading comprehension. So we know teaching works. Metalinguistic facility is absolutely essential in the writing process for the initial production of a composition, for revision and editing, as writers choose their words, analyze their communicative intents, and assess what syntax will carry those functions. And that is, you will see the authors in all script. We also know that explicit teaching about language and using language as a tool is important for literacy development. And again, that teaching should really start very early, and if we're lucky, it has. And also it should be part even of early language intervention, because we need to build the scaffolding for the later development of the finer and more and higher level metalinguistic skills. Some metalinguistic skills have an impact on performance. For example, making and understanding inferences, highly important. We know that from the literature in speech-language pathology. Using and understanding multiple meaning words, very important. That is the basis for using figurative language, humor, and understanding. They may not have to use it, but it's kind of nice to be able to understand humor. Another thing is formulating spoken or written sentences that meet cultural expectations for conveying messages or expressing emotions or opinions. And if we do not adhere or follow meta-linguistic rules, we come out as very rude, passive-aggressive, aggressive sometimes, and basically as individuals who we don't want to be your friend because you're too direct, you're too rude, you really you're a jerk, you're an outsider. Okay. In the test of metalinguistic CELF-5, we test making inferences, and it's also tested in the rating scale. Conversational skills, can you respond to, or can you initiate conversation in a context, and it's also on the index or rating index. Multiple meanings, the meta-semantic index and figurative language, and that's the meta-semantic index. Now, you may not have seen CELF-5 metalinguistics, but you may at some time want to take a look at it because I think you will probably have students that might benefit from a look at the metalinguistic abilities. Now comes a real fun question for me. Why is there such a significant memory component to CELF-5 tests, especially recalling sentences? Now, I've been an author of the CELF since the 1980s, and at one time, the CELF tests were accused by the following statement: memory has no role in the acquisition of language and linguistic skills and language disorders. And it was an accusation or a statement that I never addressed because my background was in educational psychology and neuropsychology. And for that reason, I felt strongly memory is a part. It is the glue that holds the clothing, the semantics and the morphology and syntax. Now, first of all, we should look at the CELF-5 test structure, the types of memory, the central executive, and basically the content, language, and memory indices. And I will also there refer you to the technical manual, page 48. So let's take a look at the text structure. And let's see, where in CELF-5 do we find memory? Linguistic concepts, following directions, recalling sentences, and formulated sentences. These are highly dependent on memory, but they are different types of memory. And for that reason, we shall now go and take a closer look at some of the memory issues. Let's first look at the foundations of learning. The foundations of learning are really memory, attention, and executive functions. Without these three, you will not, or adequacy of these three areas of functions, you will not be able to progress to the high-level mature language that is required in college or in professional activities and so on. Now, as you see, this is a Venn diagram, and in the red is where basically the central executive resides. It's part of memory, attention, and executive functions. We also call that central executive our working memory. And I know that you've heard a lot about that because everybody talks about it. But before we get back to memory, let's just take a look at the memory functions. We have short-term memory, immediate, and we also have working memory. We cannot hold things in our working memory forever and ever. We have long-term memory where we have stored memory for procedures, declarative memory for semantic memory, autobiographical memory, and then we have strategic memory, namely what is the best approach? How can I solve this problem? What should my strategy be in this case? And I think you already, while you have seen this, have said to yourself, I see where my students have language disorders have problems. But let us just again look at working memory. Basically, there are two types of working memory. One is explicit, and that is the explicit working memory that we need to process and reprocess novel stimulus in a processing mode that is conscious. And that is basically activated or driven by activation of the orbital prefrontal cortices. Implicit working memory is very different. It has to do with the working memory that we have for familiar stimuli. For example, if we see the alphabet, we can say A, B, C, D, F, G, and so on. And visual stimuli, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 352, so on. And again, these are posterior cortical area activation is required and left parietal lobe activations. And working memory interacts with selective attention. So if you have a student with attention problems, you've got one with working memory problems, not necessarily vice versa. But let's take a look now at CELF-5 tests. Following directions is a highly sensitive measure of receptive language and immediate memory. Comprehension, recall, and ability to execute spoken directions are skills that are absolutely essential for performing well in the classroom, and it is highly dependent on that immediate memory. Separating the assessment of concepts and directions in CELF-5 has enabled examiners to look at comprehension of concepts separate from the ability to comprehend and recall multiple step commands. But again, following directions, immediate memory. Then we get to recalling sentences. That's also a highly sensitive measure, and it has consistently high reliability with values in the low 90s retest reliability, and that's absolutely fantastic. That's like star level. The recalling sentences provides us with a test that evaluates the interface between a student's syntactic knowledge, immediate memory, and strategic memory. Now, here we go. Syntactic knowledge you know about. Immediate memory you know. What about strategic memory? Strategic memory relates to, does the student chunk? Can the student chunk a sentence into phrases and clauses? So here is my next arrow, and there we are. We know that short-term auditory memory span in adults is 6 plus or minus 2. We know that the units can be single digits or words, or they can be built out as larger units by chunking. You wouldn't ever remember a phone number, not even your own, if you didn't chunk, and that's strategic memory. Syntax and syntactic knowledge provides the basis for chunking the long-spoken sentences that are in the test into manageable units so that you, for example, can chunk it into 3 units or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 units, depending on how long and the sentence is. For example, when you say when you look at your students' errors on these, let's take the sentence, the student who sells the most tickets to the dance will win a prize. It's an actual sentence. The students who sell, here's one, the students who sell most tickets will win a prize. That is a very common one that indicates deletion of the middle elements in the sentence, and short-term memory has this wonderful U curve where the first and the last is recalled and the middle is dropped. Now then we get to another response, an error response. The student that sold the most tickets to the dance wins the prize. And here we see who becomes that. These are substitutions, and of course that is more commonly used than who. So we know that that student just basically transformed it into common, everyday, expressive formats, and wins a prize rather than will win a prize. So the verb tense is substituted. These are very, very common substitutions. Now let's look at formulated sentences. Formulated sentences are the ones where the student uses the target word or words that are given as they were intended to be used. If the target word is an adjective, it has to be used as an adjective, or else the student will not earn credit. That means basically that the minute the student sees and hears the word, or is the word, the student says, ha, that's a modifier. It describes something. It describes size, like big, or it's a verb. It gives the action. And basically, here we go. I mean, just this very immediate translation that a linguistically competent student can do just in microseconds, actually. Now, in order for you, however, to put that word into a syntactically, grammatically, contextually appropriate sentence, you will depend on your explicit working memory, because you will need to run that word and the surrounding words and structures through your mind till you come up with, here it is. The girl is reading a book. You could also have said, the boy is reading a book. You could also have said, the teacher is carrying a book. There are lots of options here. So basically, no, carrying you couldn't say because reading was the word. Sorry, Elisabeth makes errors too. And so let's look at the next test that has a memory component. Understanding spoken paragraphs. And basically, I have found, and I basically have known that for many, many, many years, that the understanding spoken paragraph tends to capture students with attention deficit disorders, ADD, ADHD. In that test, the paragraph, there are 5 test items for every group, and these tests look at recalling main ideas, details, sequence, making inferences, predictions, and knowing about the social context. And basically, in CELF-5, the reliabilities are much better than they were in CELF-4. Now, to perform on that test, you must focus your attention, sustain it, and you must engage both your immediate and your working and your strategic memory and reasoning abilities. That's a lot of memory and attention. That's the central executive. That is one of the reasons why we can capture our kids with ADHD. And basically, somebody somewhere ought to make a study who has access to kids with ADHD, non-ADHD, language disorders, so on, and take a look at performance patterns, because I think that's a very rich field. Now, then we get to a question that it can be very important. Why would a child not have a low language memory score when he or she has a low score on recalling sentences, which is dependent on memory? Well, first of all, there are several memory tests that go in. Following directions, for example, that provides visual assists. And for that reason, following directions is easier than recalling sentences. The strategic memory tells kids, I'll just mark what she says with my eyes as she does it, and then I'll point to them. I can hang on to that visual, to my visual memory of what the stimuli were. Now, in formulated sentences, the students' working memory is supported by assists from the context. And in the examples I gave with the reading the book, I mean, there are two options for the context, and they're very clear. They're not at all hidden. You can get it right away, and it helps your working memory. In understanding paragraphs, what can help you in terms of memory is the textual thematic assists. What is this paragraph all about? What do I know about that type of situation? How can I use that knowledge to help me fix what was said so that I can recall facts and make inferences and so on? Let's take a case example that was presented with that question. 13-year-old, 8-month-old, and the recalling sentences standard score is 3, and the 90% confidence interval 2 to 4. Formulated sentences 7. Now this is a kid that really used textual thematic assists or textual contextual assists, and that would be 5 to 9. Following directions 9. Why 9? Because at 13 years, 8 months, you should have learned how to use those visual assists to compensate for your auditory memory problems. So the language and memory index is 78. And in this case, that's 73 to 83. Now, in this case, you can say 78 is very close to 80. It depends on what your school says is kind of a threshold criterion for performance. But you see, the 83 would put the students like in the slightly below average range. And so that student might not get therapy. When we now look at understanding paragraphs, here is a 6 with 4 to 8. And you can indeed see the one thing is recalling sentences that stands out. Now, then there was a question. Why was the working memory index deleted in CELF-5? It was there in CELF-4. Well, one of the things that was done before CELF-5 or during the process of developing CELF-5 was that SLPs and other users indicated that they used the working memory tests relatively infrequently. They preferred to focus on aspects of language and communication, and already that tells us, okay, maybe we should take it out. But then there is another thing that said that we could take it out. You can use the working memory tests on the CELF-4. The norms on these neuropsychological tests did not change over the period of time between CELF-4 and CELF-5. We did a field study of that, and that is to be expected. Neuropsychological measures are really deal with your cortical, subcortical, and so on, activation and adequacy of activation. So you're now saying, yes, you can use CELF-4. Another thing is you could collaborate with the school psychologist or other psychologists to obtain in-depth evaluations of the various aspects of working memory. Is it attention? Is what aspect is it here? Is it the immediate memory that is also kind of very bad? Is it that strategic memory really isn't so good? so that when this kid hears the numbers, he or she doesn't chunk it. So basically, a collaboration with a psychologist is in order. Just think back at the slide I showed you with all the types of memory. You can't test all of those. Then came a reading comprehension question. When I gave CELF-5 reading comprehension, I asked the student, what were the names of Ying's old friends? The student correctly referred back to the appropriate spot in the text and said, Sophia and Brenda, rather than Sophia and Deborah. Is this a decoding or comprehension error? How should I score the response? Well, in this case, it would certainly appear that it's a decoding error rather than a comprehension problem. And therefore, I would score that response correct, but I would add a note that said possible decoding problem, because that is something one can then discuss with classroom teachers and others. What is the student's level of decoding? Now we get to the issue of sensitivity and specificity. Well, sensitivity relates to the degree to which a test identifies a children who do indeed have the condition or disorder. Very good proofreader. I'm sorry, that's me. I am a diagnosed dyslexic, so I'm kind of allowed one or two. And basically, it deals with what is the proportion of true positives, kid has disorders, versus the number of false positives. Specificity is exactly the opposite. The degree to which a test identifies those children who do not have a condition or disorder. And basically it says, what is the proportion between true negatives and false negatives? Now, let me, when I think of sensitivity and specificity, I basically go back to my very, very first time I was told about it. The professor who talked to me about it said, think about a thermometer. Isn't it wonderful? It tells you exactly when you do and do not have a fever. But of course, you need the other reading to determine what the level of the fever is. And in the same way, when we design or develop tests, look at getting the highest sensitivity and specificity for the specific levels of self. And basically, the levels of sensitivity and specificity vary depending on where we set the criterion score for calculating hits or misses. The ideal objective would be to find a 99% true positives, 100% false positives. That would be a great test because, then you might want to resort to taking the student's temperature. When we get to clinical utility is the purpose, and what the term implies is, what is the optimal criterion or cut score we should use to minimize the number of false negatives so we don't sit and evaluate all these kids who don't have language disorders and minimize, false negatives would be they go by the wayside. They are not evaluated. Minimize false positives, that is, that we don't want all of those kids without language disorders in the pile of those we have to test within the next 3 months. We want to maximize our accuracy and minimize our cost. That's what the idea is. And basically, when we look at CELF-5 and look at the clinical utility, the optimal cut scores are 80 for both the core language index, receptive language index, and expressive language index. And that is because The sensitivity is 97%. Only 3% of kids with problems go by the wayside. The specificity is 97%. Only 3% of normal children will need to be tested by you. I think that that's kind of a fiscally responsible number. Now, what does it mean when sensitivity is 0.57 at -2 standard deviations? Doesn't it mean that the test is inaccurate? That was the question. Now, basically, we'll take a look at each of these in turns. We said that for CELF-5, a score of 80 at -1.33 standard deviation is optimal, and we looked at the sensitivity and specificity. If we go to a cut score of 77, that is at 1.5 standard deviation, then we get an acceptable sensitivity level for CELF-5 of 0.85, and the specificity is 99. Now, if we use a cut score of 70, which is at -2 standard deviation, our sensitivity is 0.57. That is, we really miss almost half the children if we use that cut score. But, of course, specificity is 1.0, so 100% of the good kids are taken care of. However, that's not responsible clinical education action. However, we are aware, and I'm sorely aware, that school systems make decisions, often arbitrary decisions, about where they put the cut score for you get services, whereas you don't get services. And there are schools who choose 1.5, even 2 standard deviations. 1.5 you can kind of live with, but if 80 were used, you would really have the optimal sensitivity and specificity. Now, some index scores are high and some are low is the question. What level of discrepancy between index scores is meaningful? Let's look at this 6-year, 8-month-old kid. Receptive language, 92 ±5 for confidence interval. Expressive language score, 64 ±5. The difference is 28, and if we look up in our manual for prevalence, that occurs in 1.1% of the sample of thousands of kids that were tested. That means basically that's significant. When we look at the language and content and language structure, 88, 73, difference is 15. That prevalence is 6.4%, and that is certainly significant at the 0.05 level. The prevalence of 1.1 is significant at the 0.01 level. But there is another rule of thumb score, or rule of thumb rule that I kind of use. If the 90% intervals do not overlap, that's a significant discrepancy. 83 lower, 69 for expressive higher, highest, don't overlap. We take a look here, 84, 92, 69, 77 for content and structure. They don't overlap either. So just by a rule of thumb, I could say, I can see they don't overlap. But, to be scientific and accurate, so on, we look it up and we can tell what the prevalence is. Gives us more power, especially in court. Now, some test scores are high and some are low. What level of discrepancy between test scores is meaningful? And basically, there again, the rule of thumb is a scale score of 3 from the mean of the scale scores. And here you see the mean is 6, rounded down from 6.29. And basically anything that is +3 or -3. So recalling sentences, weakness, formulated sentences, weakness, sentence comprehension, strengths, following directions, strengths. But again, the rule is scale score of 3 or more are significant. So as we now look at where we are in today's world, there's more and more emphasis on executive functions, and basically I kind of said, yes, CELF can identify executive function disorders. We have already talked about the central executive. Let's talk about some more. There we are with the central executive. And as we look more, one of the things of executive functions is behavioral regulation, lack of impulsivity, inhibiting prepotent content or cognitive or emotional responses equals if the student has impulsivity, you have a problem with self-regulation of behaviors. You can see that and observe that as you assess the child and make a note of it. As a matter of fact, I think if there ever is a CELF-6, it had better get an executive function rating scale, because I think it's rather important to be able to check these off as you go and observe it. Another issue is initiation of action, readiness to start the action. And there is the lobe involved. One of the places where we see that is on structured writing. The students who can't initiate actions, they have a long time to get started. They also, it's just they are slower than molasses in getting going. And you might need to cue them or read, for example, for structured writing, read the first sentence that is in print and say, okay, here it is, now let's move on, and then make a note of that you read it to the students. Planning and organization, sequencing and prioritizing, categorizing and developing options. These are extremely important behaviors. Now, CELF-5 does not necessarily address the planning. You see a little of it in formulated sentences, because sentences has to be organized by structure. You have to plan it in your working memory. And so, yes, we see evidence of that. If you can't do that, we know there's also underlying that linguistic disorders is probably an executive function disorder that relates to planning and organizing. And you see that the student's desk is not organized, and student is, can't get the homework done because that requires planning and organizing. And then the monitoring, external monitoring to capture errors and evaluate one's own corrections. You have noticed that self-corrections do occur, and basically that identifies that external monitoring does occur, and that is a good sign. So mark it down. If there's no evidence of self-monitoring or awareness that errors were made, that's not a good sign. Now, another thing is, and that's responding to feedback and shifting. When you take a language test, you have to shift. Every item is a new world, and you have to do cognitive shifting all the time. And basically, that cognitive shifting is part of executive functions, and we often find that students who show perseverations don't do that shifting, or perseverations in terms of repetitions. They have problems with the cognitive shifting. That, again, is an executive function, and that, again, is something that needs to be worked with. And I don't know how I am on time, but let me just show you the last, or this slide, which can be the last one, and that is, which disorders do we have that, when diagnosed, tell us there are executive dysfunctions? Anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive disorders, autism, pervasive developmental delays, Asperger's, which we don't use anymore, sensory integration mood disorders, depression, bipolar disorders, hyperactivity, ADD and hyperactivity, and learning disabilities, including dyslexia. And so we do find basically that executive dysfunctions constitute a comorbidity that is important to identify and also important to have evaluated in depth by psychologists.
There are no CEUs available for the recorded webinar if you're listening to the recording on the speechandlanguage.com site. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Wiig. You got through almost